Earlier this week, telecoms giant MTN altered plans to impose a certain unstructured supplementary services data USSD charge on its customers. Nigerian patrons of the multinational promptly registered their disapproval of the plan the very moment it became clear what the intention was. And now, despite the advertised benefits of having that extra charge in place, everything seems back to square one. We'll be joined shortly for a conversation on this burning issue by Gbenga Adebayo, the chairman of the Association of Licensed Telecom Operators of Nigeria, ALTON. He will be expected to answer questions regarding what USSD really means and what additional burden could be placed on businesses in the telecoms industry. In what ways could the extra charge affect customers, and how effective has the regulator been? And what is the expected role of government in terms of protecting the interests of consumers? When will Nigerians stop complaining, for example, about inconsistency in the delivery of quality services, service charges, and operational infrastructure, among others? We'll also bring you an interview conducted by our own Ojiope with Adewale Akinnuoye Agbaje, a Hollywood British-born Nigerian actor, about his film, Farming, which has been in the country, being promoted by Agbaje himself.
Moving on, we shall be speaking with Achike Chude, a public affairs analyst, and he'll be looking at President Buhari's trip to Russia and participation at the Russia-Africa Summit. Next up will be Azu Nwagbogu, founder and director of the African Artists Foundation and Lagos Photo Festival, which is exactly what he'll be sharing his thoughts on. And as we hit the home stretch, it'll be time to entertain Ada Udechukwu, head Women Banking at Access Bank PLC. She'll be discussing women's access to healthcare in Nigeria.
And of course, we'll be catching up on news-making headlines across the globe, as well as reviewing the newspapers with Arise News analyst Emmanuel Efeni. It's going to be all of that and a whole lot more today on The Morning Show.
Welcome back to The Morning Show here on Arise News. It's now time to take a look at news stories making headlines around the globe. The Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, on Thursday completely prohibited individuals and local firms from investing in both its primary and secondary open market operations, OMO, auctions. The central bank's directive was contained in a circular titled Re-Open Market Operations Auctions, dated October 24, 2019, and signed by its Director, Financial Markets Department, Dr. Angela Sere Ejembi, a copy of which our sister outfit This Day obtained. With this new CBN directive, investing in OMO bills would now be for banks and foreign investors alone. However, some financial institutions, such as PFAs, that hold significant amounts of treasury bills and OMO instruments in their portfolio are now by law requested to invest in such instruments. So yes, those PFAs got caught up in this, but I understand and approve of CBN's thinking in this regard, because they are trying to boost lending to the real sector. And banks, well, some banks and some customers were trying to be clever by half, trying to meet up that the new LDR, loan deposit ratio. Some banks were lending to customers so that the customers can just go and buy treasury bills, which defeats the entire purpose. Exactly. So these loopholes do have to be plugged.
Well, I think let's contextualize it. Ordinarily, the lending to deposit ratio is supposed to be about 80%. Yeah. But what happened, of course, is that this has been observed more in the breach. So in July 3, the Central Bank of Nigeria issued a memo saying that deposit money banks must ensure that their loan-to-deposit ratio must be 60%. 60% by the end of September 30. Now, if any bank fails to do that, then, of course, it will have its cash reserve facility ratio penalized by up to 50% of the shortfall. Now, what happened was that by September 30, most of the banks were able to meet that deadline. I mean, the first-year banks probably do not have problems, but at least by September 30, only 12 banks defaulted, and those 12 banks were penalized. And on the basis of that, the central bank committed to increasing lending to the real sector, in the retail sector, in the mortgage sector, in the small and medium enterprises sector. Then said, well, this initiative seems to be working. In fact, they crowed about it. They said there had been an increase and success and all of that. And on the basis of that, the central bank went for that to say that it will sustain the strategy because it's supposed to be reviewed every quarter. So in any case, they said, well, they were given another deadline of December 31, 2019, and now it will be 65% of the LDR, lending to deposit ratio. But at the recent meeting of the Bretton Woods Institution in Washington, D.C., Isaac Okoroafo, the spokesperson for the CBN, then disclosed that the CBN had discovered that indeed these deposit money banks had managed to bypass that instruction, that directive by the central bank. What they do is that, they just lend to these individuals and local corporates who now still go around and put the money, use the money to buy treasury bills or what is called government securities. And then at the end of the day, when you buy government securities, the interest rate is given out at a very low rate. And at the end of the day, the bank, doesn't really lose any money. It has not really lent anything because the money is taken back into the system. There is arbitrage in between. And at the end of the day, the policy of the Central Bank of Nigeria to increase lending and generate more activity within the economy and correct anomalies that have been observed in terms of how banks respect, monetary policy and financial regulations will have been defeated. So what the CBN has now done is to let the banks realize that, they've seen the mischief that have been adopted by the deposit money banks in circumventing that policy. And what they have not said is that, okay, yes, don't lend to individuals and, local corporates at both primary and secondary levels. Because the initial assumption when that memo came out was that this will apply only to the primary level, at both primary and secondary level. So this is a case of the CBN and the deposit money banks playing a cat and mouse game. Or if we use West African English, what West Africans will call a Koneman Die, Koneman Beriam, that's pidgin. But, in proper English, it looks like a cat and mouse game. But I think we should praise the CBN for discovering this. It means that the CBN is attentive because there was unusual activity, in the trading in government securities. And the CBN has been able to track down the mischief of the bankers, and then it has come up with this, directive on open market operations, which is a liquidity management tool that is adopted by the central bank. And the overall objective of ensuring lending to the real sector, I think, is a good objective.
Certainly, the loopholes have to be plugged. I don't know if the banks really thought they were going to get away with this for too long. The CBN had to eventually pick up on it.
Well, they'll try it for as long as they can,
Honestly,
so they're
it's
stopped.
Just so cheeky.
So they're stopped in their tracks. Now, Nigeria's Treasury is considering ring-fencing funds generated from an increase in its value-added tax rates for spending on items such as education and health in an effort to make higher levies more acceptable to taxpayers. The Nigerian Budget Office has proposed to raise the VAT rate from 7.5% from 5% in the 2020 budget as part of efforts to boost revenue in a nation that's missed annual earning projections every year since 2016. Putting the extra taxes aside for a specific purpose could help address some of the dissatisfaction about the increase, Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed said in an interview Friday at the annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank in Washington. She also said in quotes, we thought doing the ring fencing will give people comfort and assurance and enable a closer scrutiny on how that incremental VAT increase is used, end quote. Well, I do appreciate the federal government's responsiveness. They've clearly heard the sort of distrust that's behind people's reticence when it comes to tax paying. But the hope is that they manage to capture the 60% of Nigerians who ought to be paying taxes and are not. And I have to say, I do now think of Winston Churchill, who said, a country who tries to sort of boost their revenue with taxes is akin, he compared it to a man standing in the bucket, trying to lift himself up by holding the handle. So I have to leave that there as well for consideration. It's not, all of this whole emphasis on taxation sort of shows a lack of imagination, I think.
Well, I mean, the concern of the federal government is to widen the tax base first. And we all know, of course, that many Nigerians do not like to pay tax. There is the crisis of non-compliance. And that has to do with the fact that there is a trust deficit generally in terms of the relationship between government and the people. So, the Minister of Finance is in order to say that, the VAT process will be ring-fenced in order to build the confidence of the people, the trust of the people, and that the money will be set aside for education and health. And she's hoping that, that will encourage people to buy into the proposal, both by the Budget Office and President Buhari in the Fiscal Strategy Bill, accompanying the appropriation bill, to know that, the money will be properly deployed. Now, whether that will reassure Nigerians one way or the other is another thing. The second point, of course, is that, consistently the Nigerian government has faced the challenge of diversifying its revenue base due to shortfalls in both oil and and non-oil receipts, and the uncertainty, particularly in the oil and gas sector, which accounts for, most of our revenue. The third point, of course, which justifies the proposal by both the Budget Office and the President, is that Nigeria comparatively has one of the lowest VAT rates in Africa, and you have always said that. Even the 7.5% that is being proposed is less than half of what is paid in South Africa. And the 5%, the extant 5%, is just about 0.8% of Nigeria's GDP. So you may think that on the surface of it, it may look like they have some justification for the proposal. However, the argument is that, what amount of money will accrue to the federal government, in terms of VAT. Since 2016, they've not been able to meet their projections. It's been going down. What is the guarantee, that we'll be able to meet the projections in 2020? Again, VAT, 85% of it goes to the states, not to the federal government. Exactly. So the federal government cannot really say it's expecting a lot to come from a VAT as proposed in the 2020 budget. And then in any case, capital expenditure is about 24% of the entire budget. So, I don't think that the expectation will work. But let's go on break, commercial break. When we return, the conversation will continue.
Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still in Nigeria, where the chairman of the Independent National Electoral Commission, INEC, Professor Mahmood Yakubu, has called for financial autonomy for the 36 states' independent electoral bodies, stating that independent financial protections will enhance their performance. He also called for the streamlining and review of electoral laws to increase the credibility of local government elections. Yakubu told members of the Forum of State Independent Electoral Commissions of Nigeria, who visited him in Abuja, that the two issues of financial autonomy and electoral law reform, critical to the conduct of free, fair, and credible elections at the local government level, needed to be seriously considered. According to the INEC chairman, there have been discussions in the past on the need to have a modern law model of the Electoral Act to govern the conduct of local government elections nationwide. He explained that while there was a law establishing SIEC and its composition, each state has its procedures, regulations, and guidelines for the conduct of local government elections. So, I completely agree with him and support him. There needs to be wholesale reform, and that's all very well and good. And we all know the challenges that occur when anybody is not independent. When you lack financial autonomy, you cannot be called independent, as the name suggests, which is all very well and good. But I wonder why the main issue has been avoided, that of the electoral amendment bill, which is still sort of hanging somewhere in the ether. It's between the legislature and the executive somewhere. That also needs to have been said. But I do like the point that he's making, highlighting the issue, because that we tend to focus so much on presidential elections and then state elections, and everybody forgets about local government elections. So I like that he's highlighting discrepancies with that. That should be a uniform process all across the country.
Well, financial autonomy is a big issue in relation not just to local government elections, but to the local government system itself. You'll recall that when the National Financial Intelligence Unit gave directives about, direct disbursement of federal revenue allocation to local governments, the whole issue was about autonomy of the local government system itself. Now, there is also the issue of financial autonomy for the judiciary to make sure that, these two levels, both the local councils and the judiciary are, independent and cannot be subjected to the control of governors. Because what we have seen is that governors now in relation to local government elections and state independent electoral commissions have been very notorious. Virtually every local government election that had been conducted in Nigeria since 1999, because of the kind of framework that we have, you cannot say any one of them has been really successful in terms of integrity, in terms of transparency, because the governors, once they get in there, they just assume that it is within their authority and province to control and determine whatever happens at the local government level. And, of course, the practical, pragmatic, point, of course, is that if you control the local councils, then, of course, you'll be able to control your own destiny, in terms of getting a second term, in terms of becoming an overlord within the state. And I think that, beyond just the statement, this is what the INEC chairman is drawing attention to, that if those state independent electoral commissions are free, and independent, and they have financial independence, then they will not be at the beck and call or at the mercy of governors who want to use local government elections to defend their own political interests and perpetuate themselves in office and stretch the scope of the authority or power that is given to them under the Nigerian Constitution. So it's perfectly right to say that we need to have reform, because as it is, the INEC, which is the federal body, does not control the state independent electoral commissions. They have no powers over them, but they will make returns at the end of the day. So we need to rescue, those local council elections from the grip of these, greedy and authoritative and tyrannical state governors who, for their own personal interests, will not allow the local councils to operate as an independent tier of government, either in terms of resources or in terms of how persons are elected into those positions. So all of this is within the framework of the recognition of the local government system, as an independent system within the governance framework or structure that we have in Nigeria. But the overall thing, of course, is what he's calling for, electoral reform, and we would like to see, INEC following up closely on its promise that it will make specific recommendations on reforms that should be carried out.
Absolutely. I mean, it's good that he's come out and he's made this call, especially as yesterday we were also discussing Professor Jega and his take on what he's been saying lately on electoral reform and the system as a whole. But once again, he's not saying anything that isn't the obvious. And it's less about what we want to hear and more about how we're seeing electoral bodies and institutions actually acting on this and making it a practice. And we want to know what progress you're making with that, not what it's supposed to be. So for me, until he comes out with that information for the public, which is actually important, I don't really think he's saying anything that goes to show that our electoral bodies right now are doing anything different. It all just seems to be the same jargon.
With regard to legislation, INEC can't do that. That's the State House of Assembly. And to go to your point as well about trying to prevent political fiefdoms being established, will State Houses of Assembly really be alive to this responsibility when they are, generally perceived as being under the thumb of state governors themselves? Puppets. It all remains to be seen. Now to Indonesia, where recommendations for closer scrutiny of automated control systems, better design of flight deck alerts, and accounting for a more diverse pilot population in the wake of Boeing 737 MAX crash. The report was published by the Seattle Times ahead of the official press conference that takes place in about an hour's time. The newspaper received an advance copy of a final report on the crash of a Lion Air jet that killed all 189 people on board in October last year. Indonesian investigators this week told families of the victims that a mix of factors contributed to the crash, including mechanical and design issues and a lack of documentation about how systems would behave. I mean, this unspeakable tragedy, and that it turns out that it was quite easily preventable. You read about little lapses that turned out to have such fatal consequences, like the day before there were complications on a flight, an off-duty pilot just happened to be on the plane and they were able to have more hands to manage that situation. They wrote a report, did not give all the details, and then could not even file the report because the office had closed. So the next day, the Lion Air crew did not have access to that report. It's just so tragic how it could all have been prevented. And Boeing, especially, with all their assumptions, as they call them, of how a pilot will behave in the case of distress or an error, which were completely wrong. And Boeing has lost a lot of money with regards to the grounding of Boeing Air Max planes, and rightly so. I don't even know what it's going to take for anybody to confidently get on one of those planes. Would you, Dr. Abati?
Well, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration body in the United States, immediately after these incidents occurred, 2 incidents within 5 months, decided to ground MAX 737 aircraft. And of course, many of the airlines have been complaining that they are losing money. But I don't think that the complaint about the loss of money is what will resonate with the rest of the world. The fact that lives were lost, in the incident with Lion Air on October 29, 2018, 189 lives were lost. More lives were lost in the one involving, in March 2019, involving the Ethiopian MAX 737 airline. But what has happened in this case is the investigation by Indonesian investigators. And you are quite right, because part of their report, they pointed out the issue about the pilot not even understanding the manual, and that more training will be required for pilots who intend to fly MAX 737. That's one. 2, they also indicted Lion Air, although Lion Air has refused to make a comment, that, the airline itself did not do due diligence because there had been observations of deficiencies, previously. And on the basis of that, Lion Air could have taken the proactive measure of grounding, its 737 MAX fleet. However, beyond that, most of what is contained in the report by the Indonesian investigators is already known. Boeing itself had, carried out inquiry investigation, and it has promised to do software fixes. It has promised to update the manual. It has promised to address the challenge of the MCAS. The MCAS is the angle of, ascent, by the aircraft. What is observed with the MAX 737 is that if instead of going up, it noses down. And when it noses down, it throws the pilot out of control, and the pilots are supposed to report any kind of, deficiency within 3 seconds. But of course, if the manual is not explicit enough, then you have this, crisis that we've been faced with, both in Indonesia and with Ethiopian Airlines. But I think the good news, of course, is that, production of MAX 737 going forward has been suspended. The fleet has been grounded all over the world. I don't want to hear that anybody is losing money. I think that the cost of human life, is something that we ought to worry more about. I mean, Nigeria lost a leading intellectual and a prominent diplomat in the Ethiopian, crash. Even if it is for that reason at all, I would like to suggest that they should stop completely the production of MAX 737, because even if you redesign MAX 737 in any other name, I don't think too many people will be excited, boarding that
This
aircraft.
is the air wouldn't.
Yeah, because it's such a big tragedy. You had 2 huge air crashes on that particular fleet. And I'm so happy that the Indonesians had carried out their own investigation to come forward with certain facts that Boeing would not necessarily put forward themselves on their own. Yes, your manuals are not that great for pilots who are going to come on board and fly this plane. You have to be able to, you can't put people in a position that they're not used to and expect them to act on it because it's your new technology. That new technology has to come with the right resources for the person that's about to use it. Otherwise, it's going to be a complete mess. Hundreds of people are dead because of this. So it's too big a tragedy for this to just slide in any direction except for them just getting it prim and proper this time around and saying, you know what, we're keeping this plane grounded. You're right, Dr. Abbas, even if they change the name, what difference is it going to make? That's it's one of every biggest flyer's fears now, to get on a Boeing 737. No one wants to hear that it's coming back. So Boeing really needs to just take it back to the drawing board on this one.
And that assumption that the pilot would alert the authorities in 3 seconds, that is a stupid assumption. Because a trained pilot will try and troubleshoot. Yes, your first instinct is not going to report it. Oh, it's maddening. Anyway, that's all on the news headlines.